15,000 Roman soldiers were dead before sunset. Hannibal was marching toward Rome, and the Republic was desperate for a commander. So Rome chose Quintus Fabius Maximus. But when everyone expected him to attack, he refused to fight. His own soldiers called him a coward. His enemies thought he was afraid. But Fabius understood something Rome didn't. If Hannibal wanted a battle, the last thing Rome could afford was to give him one. In 218 BC, Rome believed it could not lose. The Republic had already crushed Carthage once in a brutal war fought mostly at sea. Carthage lost territory, lost ships, and lost pride. So, when a young Carthaginian commander named Hannibal Barca began raising an army in Spain, Roman senators barely blinked. He was ambitious, sure, but Carthage had tried Rome before and failed. What Rome did not expect was for Hannibal to do the impossible. He marched an army, including war elephants, across the Alps in the dead of winter, losing thousands of men to cold and hunger along the way, and emerged in northern Italy ready for war. Rome had prepared for a naval conflict along its coastline. Instead, an enemy army was suddenly standing on Roman soil, and nobody in the Senate had a plan for that. Roman military culture was built entirely around meeting an enemy head-on. Legions were trained to close distance, form disciplined lines, and grind down opponents through sheer organization. An approach that had worked against Gauls, against Greeks, and against Carthage itself only a generation earlier. So Rome sent its legions to crush Hannibal quickly, certain that discipline and numbers would settle things fast. At the Trebia River, Hannibal lured a Roman army into a freezing ambush, hiding cavalry and infantry along the riverbanks. Thousands of Roman soldiers died in the water and the mud. Rome told itself this was a fluke, bad terrain, bad luck. Then came Lake Trasimene. Hannibal hid his entire army along a narrow lakeside road shrouded in morning fog, and when the Roman column marched through, he crushed it from 3 sides at once. 15,000 Romans died in barely 3 hours, many of them drowning as they tried to flee into the lake itself. Panic spread through Rome like fire. For the first time in generations, people feared their own capital might fall. The strategy of patience. It was in this atmosphere of fear that the Senate turned to Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus. He came from an old, respected family, a man already in his late 50s with a long record of political and military service behind him, having already served as consul and censor. His appointment as dictator was itself a sign of how desperate the crisis had become, since Rome only granted that emergency power when the Republic's survival felt genuinely uncertain. The public expected him to gather every available soldier and march out to avenge Trasimene immediately. Instead, Fabius did something almost nobody in Rome had seen a commander do before. He refused to fight. The reasoning was not fear, it was arithmetic. Hannibal's cavalry was faster, better trained, and more experienced than anything Rome could currently field. His infantry had already survived the Alps and 2 crushing victories to a force that expected to win. Rome's armies, by contrast, were shaken, undertrained, and still bleeding from 2 disasters in a row. Fabius understood a brutal truth. If he gave Hannibal the open battlefield he wanted, Rome would likely lose its last real army, and with it, the war itself. So, instead of chasing glory, Fabius chose patience. This became known as the Fabian Strategy, and it was far more aggressive than it looked from the outside. Fabius kept his legions on high ground, always shadowing Hannibal's army from a safe distance, watching every move without ever committing to open combat. When Hannibal's forces went searching for food, Fabius burned crops and stores ahead of them, denying the enemy the supplies an invading army desperately needed. Small Carthaginian raiding parties that wandered too far from the main force were ambushed and picked off. Hannibal was deep in hostile territory with no easy way to resupply from Carthage, and every week that passed without a decisive battle cost him men, horses, and morale he could not easily replace. Fabius always chose hill country and defensible terrain to camp on, ground where Hannibal's superior cavalry could not maneuver freely and force a decisive engagement. He kept his legions close enough to threaten and harass, but never close enough to be drawn into the kind of open-field battle where Hannibal's tactical genius could do the most damage. Fabius was not avoiding the war. He was fighting a completely different kind of war, one designed to bleed Hannibal slowly instead of risking everything on a single afternoon. To the Roman public, none of this looked like strategy. It looked like cowardice. Soldiers grumbled in their camps, frustrated at watching the enemy roam freely through Italian farmland while their own general refused to give the order to attack. Political rivals in Rome accused Fabius of dragging out the war to protect his own position, and some even suggested he was secretly working with the enemy, an accusation with no real evidence behind it. Critics started calling him cunctator, the delayer, meaning it as an insult aimed at a man they believed was too timid to lead. His own master of horse, Marcus Minucius Rufus, publicly criticized him and was eventually given equal command by the Senate, splitting the army in a move that nearly ended in disaster when Minucius rushed into battle and had to be rescued by the very general he had mocked. Fabius endured the insults without changing course. He understood something his critics did not. Wars are not always won by the side with more courage. They are won by the side that survives long enough to strike at the right moment, the vindication. Rome eventually grew tired of waiting. Command shifted to two new consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, who assembled the largest Roman army ever fielded up to that point and marched to finally end Hannibal in open battle near a small town called Cannae. What followed remains one of the most devastating single days in military history. Hannibal allowed his center to bend inward while his flanks and cavalry closed around the Roman formation from both sides, trapping tens of thousands of soldiers with almost nowhere to retreat. Ancient sources estimate that somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Romans were killed in a single day. Though modern historians debate the exact figures, entire families in Rome lost every male relative at once. It remains, by any measure, one of the worst military disasters the Republic ever suffered. Cannae proved Fabius right in the cruelest possible way. Every argument he had made about Hannibal's tactical brilliance and Rome's need for patience was written in Roman blood on that battlefield. In the aftermath, the Senate quietly returned to the strategy it had mocked only months earlier. Rome avoided large, decisive confrontations with Hannibal directly. Instead, it rebuilt its armies, reinforced its allies, and slowly reclaimed territory Hannibal had taken, all while denying him the single crushing battle that could end the war on his terms. This patient, grinding approach bought Rome the time it needed to develop new commanders and new strategies elsewhere. That time eventually produced Scipio Africanus, a general who studied Hannibal's tactics carefully and took the war to Carthage's own doorstep in North Africa. Facing a threat to his home city, Hannibal was recalled from Italy after more than a decade of campaigning there without ever losing a major battle on Roman soil. At the Battle of Zama, Scipio finally defeated him, ending the war and confirming what Fabius had understood years earlier. Hannibal could win battles almost indefinitely. What he could never do was win the war outright, not against an enemy willing to trade quick victories for a longer, more patient fight. The Fabian strategy did not disappear with Fabius Maximus. Military thinkers have studied it for over 2,000 years as one of the clearest examples of attrition warfare, the idea that wearing down a stronger enemy over time can succeed where direct confrontation would fail. Commanders across different eras have drawn on similar principles when facing opponents with superior firepower or momentum, choosing to avoid decisive engagement until conditions shift in their favor. Russian General Mikhail Kutuzov used comparable delaying tactics against Napoleon's invasion in 1812, trading territory for time as the harsh winter and stretched supply lines wore down the French army. The idea outlived the battlefield entirely, too. In 19th century Britain, a group of socialist reformers even named themselves the Fabian Society, borrowing his name to describe their own strategy of gradual, patient change rather than sudden revolution. Military academies still reference the original strategy today, not as a single tactic, but as a broader lesson in patience under pressure. History tends to remember the generals who charged first, the ones whose victories came fast and dramatic. But Rome did not survive Hannibal because of a single brilliant battle. It survived because one man was willing to be called a coward for years, absorbing public humiliation while quietly starving his enemy of the fight he wanted most. Sometimes the bravest decision a leader can make is not to fight at all, but to wait until the moment finally favors him.